The name Sychar is found only here in John 4, verse 5. But it is universally considered to be the same town as Shechem. It is believed that in consequence of the animosity felt by the Jews towards the Samaritans, and as an allusion to the idolatry of Samaria, Shechem was nicknamed Sychar, which means falsehood or drunkard, a drunken person. Few places in Palestine have had so much of biblical history connected with them. Here, God first appeared to Abraham. Here, Jacob dwelled when he first returned from Paddan Aram. Here, Joseph's brethren fed their flocks when they sold their brother into slavery. Here, if you may recall, Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel and spoke his last iconic words: "Choose for yourself this day whom you will serve." Here, close to Shechem, standing in a valley between two mountains, Ebal and Gerizim, Jesus sat surrounded, spread far and wide by plains of barley and wheat. As I drive down these fields and down the street in North Carolina, passing these fields, I can't help but to admire the fields of wheat planted at this time of year. I have weaved slightly in and out of traffic more than once, pray for me, because it captivates me. It's beautiful seeing how uniformly it grows, how it waves with the wind. And as I read this story, I imagine Jesus sitting at the well at noon in the heat of the day, looking out into the fields as they are dancing in the breeze. Then a woman of Samaria comes into the scene, and immediately Christ says to her, "Give me to drink." Here in the United States, asking for a drink denotes little, apart from the fact that you are thirsty, but it is not so in the Middle East. There, the giving and receiving of a drink of water is the seeking and making of a covenant of peace. When water is shared, a truce is made, at least for the time being, and even between the deadliest of enemies. In this context, we see a new significance to the question which followed. The woman said, "How is it that you, being a Jew, ask me, a Samaritan woman, ask a drink of me, a Samaritan woman?" The ruins of the Samaritan temple, a temple which was destroyed by Jews in Maccabean Wars only 140 years prior to this conversation taking place, was visible to them from where they stood, at the top of Mount Gerizim. I say only 140 years because history and tradition dies hard in the Middle East. This ruined temple stood as a constant reminder of the animosity that had built up between Jews and Samaria. The animosity is clearly depicted. Jews had no dealings with Samaritans, and vice versa. So the woman asked, "How is it that you, being a Jew, ask me, a Samaritan, for peace?" Despite the enmity, Christ seizes the opportunity. He disregards the animosity and turns the conversation to spiritual matters. And all the while, in a gentle manner, he corrects the woman. He informs her of her place in contrast to his. The woman asks, "How can you, a Jew, ask of me?" Jesus corrects her with much gentility. If you knew the gift of God and who it is who says to you, "Give me a drink." The Greek text is clear. He never asked a question. Instead, he commands, "Dos moi pain." Give me a drink. Give is in the imperative verbal form. It is a command, not a question. Christ's commands demands peace from all who come into contact with him. He will not deny who he is, and though he does not accept error, he always meets his demand for peace with the same, never debasing his character to meet that of others. God's people are never to deny their identity as the children of God, nor debase their character for the sake of another. If you knew the gift of God and who it is who says to you, "Give me peace," you would have asked of him, and he would have given you living water. This woman is not dumb. Quite the contrary. She understands that Jesus is exerting himself to what we understand to be his proper place. Yet because he does so without reproach or violence of any sort, she returns the demeanor, and a soft answer turns away wrath. When before she called him a Jew, now she calls him sir. But she is far from letting her ego go. She first informs Jesus that he has no way of getting water. Then in verse 12 she states, "Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as well as his sons and his livestock?" Most of our translations state the verse as a question. However, Greek commentaries inform us that because the pronoun you is in the emphatic, a more grammatically correct rendering would be, "You surely are not greater than our ancestor Jacob." While Jesus is pointing the conversation upward, this woman is attempting to bring it down. It and him. But Christ has no ego. He presses on. "Whoever drinks of this water will thirst again, but whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst. The water that I shall give him will become in him a fountain of water, springing up into everlasting life." In the land where most of the scriptures were written, there was, for the greater part of the year, hot, burning, and scorching heat. There was no winter as we understand it. Water was as precious as gold. It took a lot of manpower and resources to dig a well. Digging a well was done by kings and princes. Imagine the time and effort and the supplies that are needed to dig 200 feet into the ground with just a shovel. When we keep this in mind, we can understand the beauty and the force of the illusion which Jesus is using. A well was a precious commodity, and digging one rendered a man the benefactor, protector, and leader of his people. This woman must have thought Jesus was crazy. By using this word, this man standing in front of her is claiming to be a king. So she says, "Okay, sir, give me this water that I may not thirst, nor come here to draw." And in her condescending response, Jesus only heard the woman's desire to thirst no more. So in order to gently lead her to recognize her need of a Savior, he drops what must have sounded to her as a bomb. He no longer speaks in cryptic languages that only a ready mind can understand. Instead, he speaks straight to her heart. "Go, call your husband and come here," he says. The woman answered, "I have no husband." And Jesus said to her, "You have well said, I have no husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and the one whom you now have is not your husband. You have spoken truthfully." He knows exactly what is taking place in her heart. Sometimes the most condescending people only need to know that someone understands what they're going through, what is happening within. He knows the reason why she is at the well, and the conversation is shifted to spiritual matters. She perceived that there is something special about this man. So she says, "Our fathers worshipped at this mountain, and you Jews say that Jerusalem is a place where one ought to worship." Every commentary I visited in preparation for the sermon speaks of how much of a wretched and detestable human being this woman was, and how great and glorious and merciful is our Savior. And it is true that she was a sinner. She was living with a man who was now her husband. And it is true how great is our merciful and gracious Savior. But is she detestable? She had divorced 5 times, but we don't know the reasons why she divorced. This woman is not a brute. She is not culturally naive. Her conversation with Christ opens with clear evidence that she is well aware of the political circumstances in her country, at least between the Samaritans and the Jews. So why was she there at this time? Why at this well? There were actually 2 other wells on the way from Shechem to this location. And this well was 1.5 miles away. So why did she travel 3 miles carrying her burden? One of my peers in seminary made an invaluable observation regarding this woman. It happened over a year ago, but it stayed with me. This narrative, as does all of the Bible, takes place in a patriarchal society. Men held all the power and most of the means of survival. Women hold a lower status and limited roles, one of which was childbearing. Women who could not bear children were thought to be cursed, and as a product of their own environment, they thought themselves to be cursed. In the Bible, we have an example, like Hannah, the mother of Samuel, who prior to having Samuel wept bitterly because she could not have children. Perhaps this woman was divorced because she was denied the pleasure of childbearing. Perhaps the man in her life thought her to be of little worth, seeing how she could not produce an heir. Perhaps the man who she now had refused to marry her because she could not have children. And what else was she to do, this being the case? How could she survive apart from allowing herself to be used as a sexual object by a man who did not care to join himself to her in marriage? Perhaps she made this trip to the well because she was tired of facing the eyes of others, tired of being looked down upon. Perhaps she ventured away in the middle of the day, carrying her burden alone, because spiritually she felt alone. Perhaps. We don't really know the reason, but perhaps we at times are too quick to judge. This woman was not a brute. She was not a mere harlot. A publication by Dr. Joanne Davison, a professor of Andrews University, stated the following. By the way, the only positive thing that I read regarding this woman, she says, this well woman is consistently portrayed by commentators as a disreputable character, incapable of grasping intelligent theological discourse. The details within the narrative, however, do not yield that picture. Even her question of Christ suggests differently. Her profound grasp of the theological thinking of her day is reflected in her intelligent question about worship. You see, worship is an act. It is a lifestyle. It is a way of life, which brings us closer to the divine. It joins us in perfect communion with the heavenly. By making this statement regarding the locality of worship, this woman is intelligently screaming out, I am alone. I am empty. Where can I go? What can I do to draw near to my God? Such has been the case of humanity. A study by Harvard University conducted just last year tells us that 36% of Americans, including 61% of young adults, 51% of mothers, feel what the article termed as serious loneliness. In our modern age, we live in little boxes closely stacked next to one another. We drive cars which carry us miles across the land, planes which transport us around the world in hours, phones which connect us to persons around this world instantly. The world has never been smaller, yet the idiom is true. We have never been farther away from one another. The world is plagued with loneliness. Jesus informs this woman that the Jews have it right. Salvation is of the Jew. The law, the way of life, the proper method of worship has been given to the Jew. But more importantly, he tells her, the geographical locality, the place of worship doesn't matter. What matters is the locality, the place of the heart. She does not understand. Not because she is dumb. Nicodemus, a learned scholar, one chapter before, didn't have a clue what Jesus was saying. This is because spiritual things are discerned spiritually. And she is a human being. She's marred by the misconceptions of her age, so she does not understand. If the place of worship doesn't matter, I'm sure she thought, what have I done wrong? Why has this wretchedness fallen upon me? What could I have done differently? She probably thought in her mind, you are a great man, Jesus, but the Messiah is coming. They knew he was coming because of Daniel. So the Messiah is coming. When he comes, he will tell us all things. And then I imagine Jesus standing from the well, where he was just sitting, speaking to the woman. And he declares, ego eimi. I am. There is no he in the Greek. The translation could be rendered, I am, who speaks to you. I imagine that when Jesus says this, raw and divine power burst from within him. Jesus would again use these words, ego eimi, in the Garden of Gethsemane, right before he was arrested. And those who heard him fell to the ground. Her heart must have burst within her. She immediately drops her burdens. She doesn't need to carry the water jugs anymore. She knows where to go if she is ever thirsty again. We know what happens next. The entire town is converted and receives a drink of the very same fountain of life. This story is about evangelism. Yes, of course. We need to follow the example set here by Jesus. We must meet others with meekness and kindness and patience. Show them that we know what is in their heart, that we too feel as they feel. We must offer the living water to those who thirst. Jesus demands, give me drink. And assuredly I say to you, inasmuch as you did it to one of the least of these my brethren, you have done it to me. I could have left this sermon there. This is a perfect story of evangelism. But my experience this past week, during my experience this past week, I lived the real message of this story. I told you last time I preached that I was taking the summer off, that I was going to go out and share Jesus with others. Well, I'm back in school. I'm still going to go out. You're welcome to join me, please do. But honestly, after 2 weeks off between semesters, I had enough. An idle mind is a devil's playground, and I don't like the playground. So I went back to school to keep myself busy. Then this past Friday, I was in the hospital. I was getting medication. It's normal, it's a routine for me. I go in every 2 months. But I don't know why the medication always makes me feel lesser. It takes my energy, my desire, and my focus from me. I spent around 3 hours trying to read just a few pages from a little book for an assignment that's due tomorrow, and I still haven't finished it, and I have 4 other books to read from. My mind has been clogged, and I find it very difficult to concentrate. And on top of that, I had to write this sermon. This pulpit, to me, is sacred. It is a sacred office. And I won't, in good conscience, stand here before you and preach a garbage sermon. I have preached sermons that I'm not happy with, but it is not for lack of trying. It takes a long time to prepare. And after spending the beginning of the week, from the time waking up to the afternoon, when Wednesday came around, I had nothing. All I had was some worthless notes written down on a piece of paper that I managed to gather during my small, minute moments of clarity. And then I lost whatever was left of my mind. I blame it on my medication. I'm usually very well composed, but I became stressed. I felt bad. I felt alone. If my father was in the room watching me, he would have disowned me. He would have thought I was a sissy. I wept. I felt I had no one. So I turned to God and I prayed. Thursday came around and I was there not feeling better, but something had happened. As I prayed, I started to receive moments of clarity, and I received these ideas, and I wrote them down, and my mind would go blank. And so I prayed again, and again I would receive ideas, and I wrote them down again, and my mind would go blank again. And this was the process of Thursday until last night. This is how I wrote the sermon. And by the time I was done, I had more than I needed. I cut out 2 pages worth of material. I think that this still might be the longest sermon I have yet written. I could have written more. I could have written about how her misfortune, the woman at the well, how her misfortune actually led to her salvation, and the salvation of all of those in her village. But I decided not to. I decided to condense the sermon and keep it short. You're welcome. Please do not think that I'm trying to imply that because of my toils, because of my experience, that this sermon is good. Not at all. But I am saying that more so than any other sermon, this message was brought to you by God. And here is the message. The testimony from the well. What is in the heart of this story, literally, what is in the middle, the chiastic center of this narrative. When I was alone and in despair, I went to Jesus. And all I was asking for was a little something, a little drink to get me by. I found this week that when we feel like the Samaritan woman, when we thirst, when we carry our water jugs, our burdens, when you can't take it anymore, when you are desperate, in need of direction, when you feel alone, you can speak to Jesus. He is the great I am who speaks to you. Ask him for a drink. He will give you a fountain of living water. And he invites you to take of it freely.